Kind old lady shelters 15 Hells Angels during a snowstorm. Next day, 100 bikes line up at her door. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The sound came first. Not one engine, but many. A deep rolling thunder that shook the frost from the pine trees lining Maple Ridge Road. Residents of Cedar Hollow peeked through their curtains as 100 motorcycles idled in a long, silent line stretching nearly a quarter-mile down the narrow street. Chrome gleamed under the pale winter sun. Black leather jackets carried a patch that most towns feared. Hells Angels. Patrol cars blocked both ends of the road, their light bars dark but ready. No one understood why an entire motorcycle chapter had gathered outside the smallest house on the block, a weathered one-story cabin with a sagging porch and a single rocking chair dusted in snow. Inside that house lived Margaret Whitmore, 75 years old, widow, retired school librarian, known for baking peach cobbler for the church fundraiser every July. She was not wealthy. She was not powerful. She had never even owned a motorcycle. And yet, at exactly 8:30 in the morning, 100 bikers waited at her front door in complete silence. Some neighbors whispered that trouble had finally found her. Others feared retaliation, revenge, something dark that had happened overnight. What none of them knew was that exactly 24 hours earlier, during the worst snowstorm Cedar Hollow had seen in 15 years, Margaret Whitmore had opened that same front door to 15 strangers covered in ice and road salt. They had not arrived in formation. They had not come roaring in with dominance. They had staggered up her walkway half frozen, faces raw from 40-mile-per-hour winds. One young rider barely able to stand. The storm had shut down the interstate, closed the motel, and knocked out power across 3 counties. Most people had locked their doors and prayed the night would pass. But Margaret had heard. The knock. 3 slow, heavy thuds against old wood. She had hesitated for exactly 1 heartbeat before turning the brass knob. Now, as 100 engines hummed outside her home, Cedar Hollow held its breath. Because this was not an invasion. It was not a threat. It was something no one in that town had witnessed before. And it all began with a single act of kindness on the coldest night of the year. Margaret Whitmore had always believed that a house should feel warm long before a person stepped inside it. On most winter nights, that warmth came from her old cast-iron stove and the soft hum of a classical radio station playing in the background. But on the night the storm rolled through Cedar Hollow, warmth was something she had to fight to keep. The wind howled across Maple Ridge Road at nearly 45 miles per hour, rattling her window panes and driving snow against the siding in sharp bursts that sounded like handfuls of gravel. Power had flickered twice already. Margaret sat in her rocking chair with a wool blanket around her shoulders, a book resting unopened in her lap. She had lived in this house for 48 years. Long enough to know when weather was serious and when it was simply dramatic. This storm was serious. The county emergency alert had warned residents to stay indoors. Interstate traffic had been shut down. The small motel near the highway exit had lost electricity by early evening. Most of the town had gone dark. Margaret had just risen to add another log to the stove when she heard it. 3 heavy knocks against her front door. Not frantic, not aggressive, just firm, deliberate. She froze for a moment, listening to the wind and her own heartbeat. No one visited after 9 at night in Cedar Hollow, especially not during a blizzard. She stepped closer to the door and called out, asking who was there. The wind swallowed her voice. Another knock followed, slower this time. Margaret turned the brass knob and pulled the door open against the force of the storm. 15 men stood on her porch. Snow clung to their beards and shoulders. Leather jackets were stiff with ice. Behind them, motorcycles sat half buried in drifts that had already reached nearly 12 inches high. One young rider leaned heavily against the railing, his face pale beneath wind-burned skin. The patch on their backs was unmistakable. Hells Angels. The tallest of them stepped forward. His gray beard was rimmed with frost, and his eyes were steady but tired. "Ma'am," he said gently, "the storm caught us off guard. The roads are shut down. We were hoping maybe you knew of a place still open." His voice carried respect, not demand. Margaret looked beyond him at the dark street. No headlights. No plows. No movement at all. She saw the way their hands trembled, the way one man's boots slipped slightly on the ice as he tried to keep balance. She noticed the youngest rider struggling to stay upright. She did not see monsters. She saw men who had misjudged the weather. She saw someone's sons. "You cannot stay out here," she said quietly. "You will freeze before morning." The tall man hesitated, as if surprised. "We do not want to cause trouble." Margaret shook her head once. "Trouble is letting people die on your porch. Come inside." One by one, 15 bikers stepped into her small living room, removing gloves stiff with ice, lowering their heads so they would not bump the doorway. Snow melted into puddles on her braided rug. The young rider nearly collapsed until Margaret guided him toward the couch near the stove. She handed out spare blankets she had kept since her late husband was alive. She filled a large pot with water and set it to boil for hot cocoa. Outside, the storm raged harder, sealing the town in white silence. Inside that modest house, the air began to thaw with something far stronger than heat. The living room felt smaller once the door shut against the storm. 15 men filled every available space, boots lined along the wall, leather jackets draped carefully over chairs as if each of them understood they were guests in sacred ground. The tall man with the gray beard stepped forward and removed his gloves, flexing fingers that were nearly numb. "My name is Jack Callahan," he said quietly. "Folks call me Iron. I appreciate what you are doing more than you know." Margaret gave him a short nod as she stirred cocoa powder into steaming water. "Gratitude can wait until everyone is warm," she replied. The young rider on the couch shivered violently despite the blanket wrapped around him. His name, Margaret learned, was Ethan Miller, though the others called him Knox. He could not have been more than 22 years old. His lips were pale, and his hands shook as he tried to hold the mug she placed between his fingers. Jack crouched beside him, concern written plainly across his weathered face. "We hit black ice about 10 miles back," Jack explained. "Interstate closed. We thought we could make it to the next town before the worst of it. We were wrong." Margaret pressed a gentle hand against Ethan's shoulder, feeling the chill through layers of fabric. "You need more than cocoa," she said. She disappeared down the narrow hallway and returned with a thick knitted scarf, dark blue with small imperfections in the stitching. She wrapped it carefully around Ethan's neck. "That belonged to my son," she said softly. "He hated the cold." The room fell quiet. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. A framed photograph sat on the mantel above the stove, a young man in a military uniform smiling into a camera beneath a bright desert sun. Jack noticed it immediately. "Army," he said. "Yes," Margaret answered. "Second tour overseas." He did not come home. No one spoke for several seconds. The men standing near the doorway lowered their eyes, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Jack removed his leather vest slowly, folding it with care before placing it over the back of a chair. Beneath it, a faded tattoo on his forearm revealed an infantry insignia. "I served too," he said quietly. "Long time ago." Margaret studied him differently now. Not as a biker with a feared patch on his back, but as a soldier who understood loss. She handed out bowls of canned soup she had heated on the stove, apologizing that it was not much. One of the riders, a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his chin, shook his head. "Ma'am, this is more than we expected tonight." Outside, snow continued to pile against the porch, rising nearly 18 inches high, sealing the motorcycles deeper into white drifts. Inside, boots steamed gently by the stove. The men spoke in lower voices now, respectful, almost careful not to disturb the quiet dignity of the house. Ethan's shaking gradually slowed. He looked up at Margaret with eyes that held both exhaustion and something close to disbelief. "Why are you not afraid of us?" he asked hoarsely. Margaret met his gaze without hesitation. "Because fear does not keep anyone warm," she said. "And because I see boys who misjudged a storm, not villains at my door." Jack exhaled slowly, something heavy shifting behind his steady expression. In that modest living room, beneath the hum of the stove and the howl of wind, the lines between outlaw and widow began to blur into something simpler. Human beings sharing shelter on a night that could have ended very differently. The storm did not ease as the night deepened. By 10:30, snow pressed halfway up the front windows, and the porch light cast a faint golden glow against swirling white that seemed endless. Inside, Margaret moved slowly between the stove and the small kitchen table, refilling mugs and adjusting blankets while the men settled wherever space allowed. Some sat cross-legged on the wooden floor. Others leaned against the walls, boots off, thick socks steaming gently near the heat. The house, built in 1952, was never meant to hold so many people at once, yet it did not feel crowded. It felt guarded. Jack stood near the front window, lifting the curtains slightly to check the street. Nothing moved except wind-driven snow. The town was completely shut down. No plows would reach Maple Ridge Road until morning at the earliest. He lowered the curtain and turned back toward Margaret. "You understand," he said carefully, "people in towns like this do not usually welcome us." Margaret gave a faint smile as she wiped her hands on a dish towel. People in towns like this are often too quick to decide who someone is before they ever speak to them. A few of the riders exchanged glances. One of them, a heavy-set man with silver rings along his fingers, let out a quiet breath. "We are not saints, ma'am." Margaret met his gaze evenly. "I did not ask you to be. I asked you to come inside because it is below freezing and no one deserves to freeze on my porch." Ethan shifted on the couch, color returning slowly to his cheeks. He watched Margaret move through the room with steady calm, offering an extra log for the stove, adjusting the thermostat by a single degree to conserve fuel. "You really are not afraid," he said again, softer this time. Margaret paused beside the mantel, her eyes drifting briefly to her son's photograph. "Fear is useful when something means you harm," she answered. "But tonight I see 15 men who were caught in weather they did not expect. I have lived long enough to know that storms do not care what patch you wear." The words settled heavily in the room. Outside, a sudden crack echoed through the air as a large tree branch snapped under the weight of ice somewhere down the block. Instinctively, two of the bikers rose to their feet, scanning the room as if danger might follow. Jack noticed their reaction and nodded slightly, a silent signal that all was well. Years of living on edge did not fade easily. Margaret noticed it too. "You can relax," she said gently. "This house has stood through worse than this." There was a faint tremor in her voice when she added, "It survived the night the officers came to my door." The men understood without further explanation. Jack stepped closer to the mantel, studying the photograph of her son. He looked no older than Ethan. "How old was he?" Jack asked quietly. 26, Margaret replied. "He liked motorcycles, though I never let him buy one." That drew the faintest ripple of subdued laughter from the room. Even Margaret smiled at the memory. Ethan glanced down at the blue scarf around his neck. "I will give this back before we leave," he said. Margaret shook her head once. "Keep it until you are warm. That is all that matters tonight." The wind howled harder, rattling the eaves, but inside the small house something steadier had taken root. Suspicion had not vanished entirely, but it had softened. 15 bikers who were used to being met with locked doors now found themselves watched over by a woman who saw past leather and reputation. And in the quiet glow of that stove light, even Jack Iron Callahan felt something unfamiliar. Not defiance. Not vigilance. Respect. By 11:15 that night, the storm had settled into a relentless rhythm, wind driving snow against the walls and steady waves that made the old house creak in protest. Inside, however, the atmosphere had shifted from tension to something almost unfamiliar to the men who filled the room. It felt like a family gathering after a long road trip, boots lined in careful rows, heavy jackets drying by the stove, low voices replacing the earlier edge of caution. Margaret moved with quiet efficiency, insisting that no one sit too close to the fire and rotating spots so everyone could warm their hands. She poured the last of the cocoa into chipped ceramic mugs and apologized for running low on milk. One of the riders, a broad-shouldered man named Luis, offered to ration what remained, but Margaret waved him off. "You will drink until you are warm," she said firmly. Jack watched her from across the room, arms folded loosely, studying the way the men adjusted themselves to her space. They spoke softer than usual. They picked up crumbs from the table without being asked. When one of them accidentally bumped a small stack of books, he immediately set them back exactly as they were. It was not fear guiding them. It was respect. Ethan had stopped shivering completely now. Color had returned to his face, and the blue scarf around his neck stood out against his dark shirt. He stared at the photograph of Margaret's son for a long moment before speaking. "He looks proud," he said quietly. Margaret followed his gaze. "He was stubborn," she replied, but he believed in standing up for people who could not stand up for themselves. Jack nodded slowly at that. That is something we understand, he said. Margaret looked at him carefully. Then you understand that reputation is not always truth. A faint smile crossed his face. We carry our reputation whether we want to or not. It keeps some trouble away. It invites other kinds. Outside, a distant siren wailed briefly before fading into the wind. Someone in town must have reported the line of motorcycles buried along Maple Ridge Road. Jack's posture shifted slightly, instinct alert. Margaret noticed. If someone comes, she said calmly, I will tell them you are my guests. No one will drag you from my house tonight. The certainty in her voice left no room for argument. For a woman of 75 years, barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, she carried herself with a strength that surprised even Jack. He stepped closer to the stove, lowering his voice so only she could hear. You are taking a risk for men you met an hour ago. Margaret did not hesitate. I took a risk the day I sent my son overseas, she replied. That risk did not. Bring him home. I will not lose sleep over offering soup to men caught in a snowstorm. The words landed deeper than she intended. For a moment, Jack had no response. He glanced at his brothers scattered around the room. Men who had stood beside him through bar fights, courtrooms, and hospital visits. Men who rarely received kindness without suspicion attached. Tonight, they sat quietly beneath a crocheted blanket draped over the back of a floral couch. The contrast was almost surreal. Ethan cleared his throat. Ma'am, he said, when the road's clear, we will make sure your driveway is the first one shoveled. Margaret chuckled softly. I suspect you will do more than that. The storm continued to roar outside, but inside the house, something steady had formed. 15 men who were used to bracing for hostility now found themselves under the protection of a woman who refused to see them as anything less than human. And as midnight approached, Jack Iron Callahan made a decision he did not voice aloud. This kindness would not go unanswered. Shortly after midnight, the house had grown quieter. The storm still battered the siding, but inside, exhaustion began to settle over the room like a second blanket. A few of the men dozed where they sat, heads tipped back against the wall, boots drying near the stove. Ethan had finally fallen asleep on the couch, the blue scarf tucked beneath his chin, his breathing steady and warm. Margaret dimmed the single lamp near the hallway, leaving only the soft orange glow of the fire to light the room. Jack remained awake. He stood near the mantel again, studying the photograph of Margaret's son more closely. The young man's smile carried the kind of confidence that came from believing in something larger than himself. Jack recognized it. He had seen that look on young recruits before their first deployment. He had worn it himself once. Margaret noticed him standing there. You cannot sleep, she said quietly. Jack shook his head. Old habits. He hesitated, then added, You said he did not come home. Margaret moved beside him, her hands folded gently in front of her. There was no bitterness in her expression, only a deep, settled grief. He volunteered for a second tour. Said his unit needed experienced men. I told him he had already given enough. He told me sometimes enough is not decided by comfort. The fire cracked softly between them. Jack lowered his gaze. I lost men over there too, he said. Good men. Some nights you still hear the echoes. Margaret nodded slowly. That is why I opened the door tonight. Jack looked at her, puzzled. Because you heard knocking, he said. Because I heard fear, she corrected gently. I have heard that sound before. When officers stood on this porch in dress uniforms, I heard fear in their voices before they even spoke. Fear of delivering words that change everything. Tonight your men knocked with that same sound. Not anger, not threat, just the hope that someone might answer. The weight of her words settled deep into Jack's chest. He had knocked on many doors in his life. Rarely had they opened without suspicion. He glanced across the room at his brothers, scattered across floral cushions and hardwood floors, massive frames made small by the warmth of the house. We are not always welcomed kindly, he said. Margaret smiled faintly. Neither was my son in some of the places he served. But he believed in doing right even when misunderstood. Silence lingered for several seconds. Outside, wind pushed against the roof in a low, continuous roar. Jack finally spoke again, his voice lower than before. Tomorrow, when this storm clears, you may have people in this town questioning what you did. Margaret's eyes did not waver. Let them question. Kindness does not require permission. In that moment, Something shifted in Jack Iron Callahan. The hardened edge he carried like armor loosened slightly. He was a man who commanded loyalty through strength, through reputation, through the weight of numbers. But here, in a modest house with worn carpets and faded curtains, he witnessed a different kind of strength. One that did not shout. One that did not threaten. One that simply stood firm. He turned once more to the photograph on the mantel. "Your son would be proud of you," he said quietly. Margaret's lips trembled just slightly, though her posture remained steady. "I hope so," she replied. Across the room, Ethan stirred in his sleep, clutching the scarf tighter. And for the first time in years, Jack felt the rare sting of emotion not tied to anger or loss, but to something gentler. A reminder that even men who lived on the edge of the law could still recognize honor when they saw it. The night stretched toward 2 a.m. when a new sound cut through the steady roar of wind. It was faint at first, almost swallowed by the storm, but Jack heard it immediately. Tires on packed snow. Slow. Careful. He moved toward the window and lifted the curtain just enough to see beyond the frosted glass. Headlights approached from the far end of Maple Ridge Road, beams diffused by swirling white. Not a plow. Too narrow. A single pickup truck crawled through the drifts, its engine straining. Margaret noticed the shift in his posture. "Someone from town?" she asked calmly. "Most likely," Jack replied. The truck stopped several houses down. A door slammed. Even through the wind, a voice carried faintly. Angry. Suspicious. One of the riders near the door straightened instinctively, his jaw tightening. "Word travels fast in small towns," Luis muttered under his breath. 15 motorcycles buried along the road would not go unnoticed by sunrise. Jack turned back toward the room, raising one hand slightly. "Stay put. No one moves unless I say so." His tone was firm but measured. They were guests here. They would not bring confrontation to Margaret's doorstep. Another set of headlights appeared behind the first vehicle. This time unmistakable. A sheriff's cruiser. The blue light bar flashed once, then went dark, conserving power in the storm. Margaret walked to the front door before anyone could stop her. Jack followed, stopping just behind her shoulder. "You do not have to do this," he said quietly. Margaret rested one hand on the brass knob. "I invited you inside. That makes you my responsibility." She opened the door against the wind. Snow swirled into the entryway, icy flakes brushing her face. Sheriff Daniel Harper stood on the porch, collar pulled high against the cold, hat dusted white. Behind him, a neighbor, Harold Bennett, peered from the pickup truck with visible agitation. "Evening, Mrs. Whitmore," the sheriff said, voice raised over the wind. "We got reports of motorcycles lined up out here." Margaret nodded calmly. "You see correctly." Sheriff Harper's eyes shifted past her to the silhouettes inside. "Hell's Angels," Harold Bennett called out sharply. "You cannot let them stay here." Margaret's posture did not change. "They are stranded because of the storm. They will leave when the road's clear." The sheriff studied her for a long moment. "Are you being threatened in any way?" he asked carefully. Margaret almost smiled. "The only thing threatening me tonight is this weather." Jack stepped forward just enough to be visible, but not imposing. "Sir," he said respectfully, "we are not here to cause trouble. Roads closed 10 miles back. We will remain inside until morning, and then we will clear out." The sheriff looked between them, measuring tone, posture, intent. He had known Margaret for decades. He had also known of Jack's chapter for years. Context mattered. After several seconds, Sheriff Harper nodded once. "Roads are closed until daylight. As long as there is no disturbance, you have until then." Harold Bennett looked ready to argue, but one firm glance from the sheriff silenced him. Margaret inclined her head in thanks. Sheriff Harper stepped back into the storm. The cruiser reversed slowly down the road, headlights fading into white darkness. Margaret closed the door gently. Inside, 15 pairs of eyes watched her. "You see," she said simply, "kindness does not require permission." Jack exhaled slowly, tension easing from his shoulders. Outside, the storm still raged, but something else had shifted. Cedar Hollow had taken notice. And by morning, the story of an old widow sheltering 15 bikers would be impossible to ignore. After the sheriff's cruiser disappeared into the white darkness, the house settled into a different kind of silence. Not the uncertain quiet from earlier in the evening, but something steadier. The kind that follows a test passed. Margaret latched the door carefully and turned back toward the room. 15 men watched her with expressions that were no longer guarded. They were thoughtful. even humbled. Jack stepped forward slowly. Most people would have let the law decide for them, he said. Margaret shrugged gently. I have lived long enough to know that the law does not always see the whole picture. Sometimes it needs someone to speak first. Ethan shifted upright on the couch, fully awake now. The color in his face had returned, and his voice no longer trembled. When that man yelled outside, he said quietly, I thought you might change your mind about us. Margaret walked over and adjusted the blanket at his shoulders. Young man, she replied, if I changed my mind every time someone else was afraid, I would not have much of a mind left. A low murmur of agreement moved through the room. Luis leaned back against the wall and studied the faded wallpaper, as if memorizing the moment. You remind me of my grandmother, he said softly. She used to say people show you who they are when the lights go out. Margaret smiled faintly. And what have you seen tonight? She asked. Luis glanced around at his brothers. I have seen men who are used to being judged before they speak sit quietly and drink cocoa like schoolboys. A few of the riders let out restrained laughter. Even Jack allowed himself a brief smile. The tension that had followed the sheriff's visit began to dissolve. The storm still battered the roof, but inside, conversation grew warmer. Margaret listened as the men spoke about roads they had ridden across the country, deserts in Arizona, mountains in Colorado, small diners in Kansas where the coffee never ran out. She heard pride in their stories, but also fatigue. Years on the road leave marks that are not always visible. Ethan looked again at the photograph on the mantel. If your son were here tonight, he said carefully, do you think he would have opened the door for us? Margaret did not hesitate. Yes, she said. He would have. He believed in protecting people who needed help. And tonight that was you. Jack's expression shifted at that. We are not used to being called the ones in need, he admitted. Margaret studied him for a long moment. Everyone is in need at some point, she said. The measure of a person is not whether they fall into hardship. It is what they do after someone lifts them out. The words lingered heavily in the warm air. Jack felt them settle deeper than any lecture he had received in years. He had built his chapter on loyalty and strength, on standing together when the world turned its back. But here, in a modest house on Maple Ridge Road, a 75-year-old widow had demonstrated a different kind of leadership, one rooted in quiet conviction. Ethan tightened the blue scarf around his neck. When morning comes, he said, we will not forget this. Margaret's eyes softened. I am not asking you to remember, she replied. I am asking you to carry it forward. Outside, the storm began to lose some of its fury, wind dropping slightly as the darkest part of the night passed. Inside, 15 men who had arrived as strangers now felt something unexpected take hold. Not obligation, not debt, something closer to honor. And as the fire crackled softly against the chill, Jack Iron Callahan understood that what had begun as shelter from a storm was becoming something far more lasting. By 3:30 in the morning, exhaustion finally overtook most of the men. The storm had begun to ease, though snow still drifted steadily past the windows, softening the world outside into a quiet white landscape. Inside, the fire burned lower, its glow steady and warm. Margaret moved carefully through the room one last time, making sure each man had a blanket or coat beneath his head. Even the largest of them seemed smaller now, stretched across rugs and cushions like weary travelers who had forgotten, for a few hours, the weight of reputation. Jack remained awake, seated at the small kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a cooling mug. He listened to the house breathe, old beams settling, wind brushing gently along the roof instead of striking it. Margaret joined him, lowering herself into the chair across from him. Morning will come soon, she said softly. It always does. Jack nodded, but his expression was thoughtful. When daylight hits, he said, there will be talk. Small towns do not keep quiet about things like this. Margaret gave a faint smile. Let them talk. I have survived gossip before. Jack studied her more closely now, noticing the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the strength in her posture despite her age. You live alone, he said carefully. Margaret nodded. For many years now. Jack glanced toward the window. You ever have trouble? Anyone push too hard, try to take advantage? Margaret hesitated, just briefly. There had been whispers in town over the years. Developers wanting to buy property along Maple Ridge Road. A distant cousin suggesting she sell and move closer to family. Even Harold Bennett had once hinted that an old widow might find it difficult to maintain a house alone. Nothing direct, But enough. I manage, she replied simply. Jack leaned back slightly. Some men mistake kindness for weakness. Margaret's eyes sharpened just a fraction. That is their mistake to make. A long silence followed. Then Jack spoke again, his voice lower. It will not be made here. Margaret regarded him carefully. I did not help. You to gain protection, she said. I know, Jack replied. That is precisely why it matters. Across the room, Ethan stirred and sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes. The storm has slowed, he murmured. Jack rose and walked to the front window. He lifted the curtain. The wind had nearly died, leaving behind a deep blanket of snow that reached almost 20 inches in some drifts. The motorcycles were barely visible beneath the white covering. We will have work to do before we ride out, Jack said quietly. Margaret stood beside him. Then you will start with your own machines, she replied. Jack turned to her. No, ma'am. We will start with your driveway. And your porch. And your roof if needed. Margaret exhaled softly, half amused, half moved. You do not owe me that. Jack met her eyes with steady conviction. We owe you more than that. Dawn began to press faint gray light against the horizon. The longest night of winter was nearly over. Outside, Cedar Hollow would soon wake to the sight of 15 motorcycles buried in snow outside Margaret Whitmore's home. Inside, 15 men who had arrived cold and uncertain now stood with quiet purpose. Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. No signal yet. But when it returns, he said calmly, there are calls I intend to make. Margaret did not ask what kind of calls. She simply watched the pale morning light spread across the snow. She had opened her door because it was the right thing to do. She had not imagined that by morning, the echo of that decision would travel far beyond Maple Ridge Road. Morning arrived slowly over Cedar Hollow, pale sunlight stretching across a landscape transformed into untouched white. Snow lay nearly 2 feet deep in some drifts, softening fences, burying mailboxes, and turning Maple Ridge Road into a narrow corridor carved by wind. Inside the house, the men were already awake. Years of early rides and disciplined habits did not allow them to sleep past dawn. One by one, they rose quietly, folding blankets, stacking borrowed pillows, restoring the small living room to the way they had found it. Margaret stood near the stove, watching in silence as 15 large men moved with unexpected care through her modest space. There was no rush in their movements. No careless noise. Only quiet purpose. Jack stepped outside. First, the cold air biting sharply against his face. The storm had passed completely. The sky was clear and bright, the kind of blue that only follows a hard winter night. He surveyed the road. Snow reached the lower edges of the motorcycles, burying tires and freezing chains stiff. This will take time, he called back toward the door. Luis and 2 others followed him out, boots sinking deep with each step. Without needing instruction, they began clearing the area around Margaret's porch first. Shovels were not available in abundance, but the men used what they could find. A wide snow scoop leaned against the shed. An old metal shovel hung by the side of the house. Even gloved hands worked in rhythm, pushing and lifting heavy snow away from the steps. Margaret stepped outside wrapped in her wool coat, watching them form a path from her door to the street before touching their own motorcycles. Ethan worked carefully beside the porch railing, still wearing the blue scarf. He paused long enough to look back at her. You should stay inside, he said. It is below 20 degrees. Margaret shook her head gently. I have seen colder mornings, she replied, and I want to see this one clearly. Across the street, curtains shifted. Neighbors who had heard rumors during the night now saw 15 bikers clearing snow from an elderly widow's property before even glancing at their own machines. Harold Bennett stood near his pickup truck, arms folded, expression uncertain. Sheriff Harper's cruiser rolled slowly down the block once more, this time not stopping. He observed quietly and continued on. Within 40 minutes, Margaret's driveway was fully cleared down to the gravel. The porch steps were swept clean. Ice was chipped away carefully so she would not slip. Only then did the men turn toward their motorcycles, digging them free from drifts that reached nearly 20 inches high. Engines coughed and sputtered as they warmed, exhaust rising in white plumes against the crisp air. Jack walked back to Margaret before mounting his bike. We will head out as soon as the road opens fully, he said. But this is not the end of it. Margaret met his steady gaze. There is nothing more required, she replied. Jack gave a faint smile that did not quite reach his eyes. You did not ask for anything. That is why it matters. He reached into his jacket and checked his phone again. Signal bars had returned. He sent a brief message. No explanation. Just an address and 2 words. She helped. Margaret did not see the message. She simply watched as 15 engines roared to life, echoing off snow-covered houses. The men lined up respectfully along Maple Ridge Road, helmets secured, posture steady. Before pulling away, each one nodded once toward her porch. Then they rode out in single file, disappearing toward the highway. Maple Ridge Road fell quiet again. Margaret stood alone in the bright winter sun, unaware that the echo of those engines was already traveling far beyond Cedar Hollow. The rest of that morning felt almost ordinary. Margaret returned inside her small house, hung her coat by the door, and placed a fresh log into the stove. The deep rumble of engines had faded into the distance, replaced by the soft drip of melting snow from the eaves. Sunlight streamed through the front windows, reflecting sharply off the white landscape, and filling her living room with a brightness that felt almost cleansing. She brewed a pot of coffee and carried a mug to the rocking chair near the window. Maple Ridge Road was quiet again. Tire tracks from 15 motorcycles cut a dark path through the snow, the only evidence that anything unusual had happened. Across the street, Harold Bennett pretended to shovel while stealing glances toward her house. 2 houses down, Mrs. Carter stepped onto her porch, phone pressed to her ear, undoubtedly sharing the story already spreading through Cedar Hollow. Margaret felt no anxiety about the whispers. She had opened her door because it was right, not because it would be understood. Around 10:30 in the morning, Sheriff Harper drove by once more, slower this time. He stopped briefly at the edge of her driveway and lowered his window. "Everything peaceful, Mrs. Whitmore," he called out. Margaret stepped onto the porch, careful on the cleared steps the bikers had shoveled. "Perfectly peaceful," she replied. The sheriff studied the driveway, the clean path, the neatly stacked snow banks. "They did a thorough job," he observed. "Yes, they did," Margaret answered simply. Sheriff Harper nodded once, something thoughtful in his expression. "If anyone gives you trouble over last night, you let me know." Margaret gave him a small smile. "I appreciate that, Daniel, but I suspect the trouble has already passed." The cruiser rolled on. Inside, the house still carried faint traces of their presence. A slight scent of leather and cold air lingered. A single boot print had been missed near the back door. Margaret did not rush to erase it. Instead, she moved through her room slowly, returning chairs to their exact positions, folding the last blanket with deliberate care. She paused at the mantel, touching the corner of her son's photograph. "You would have liked them," she murmured softly. "They were not what people expect." The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward noon. Life resumed its usual rhythm. The hardware store reopened. Snowplows rumbled through main streets. Children from the elementary school walked in small groups, bundled in coats and scarves, their laughter carrying through crisp air. To most of Cedar Hollow, the storm would be remembered for its depth of snow and closed roads. But for Margaret, it would be remembered for something else entirely. Around 1 in the afternoon, her telephone rang. It was her distant niece from Billings. "I heard you had quite a night," the young woman said with anxious curiosity. Margaret chuckled softly. "News travels faster than the wind," she replied. "Are you all right, Aunt Margaret?" "Perfectly fine. I had company. That was all." She ended the call and returned to her rocking chair. Outside, the sun began to dip slightly, casting longer shadows across the snow. Maple Ridge Road remained still, peaceful, ordinary. Margaret closed her eyes for a brief moment, feeling the quiet settle once more. She did not know that more than 100 miles away, Jack Iron Callahan's message had already reached ears that did not ignore such things. She did not know that by sunrise the following morning, Maple Ridge Road would no longer be quiet. For now, she simply rocked gently in her chair, unaware that kindness, once witnessed, rarely remains small. The following morning dawned brighter than the day before, the sky a sharp winter blue that made the snow along Maple Ridge Road shimmer like crushed glass. Margaret woke just after 7 and moved through her usual routine, unaware that the quiet outside was not as empty as it seemed. She poured coffee into her favorite ceramic mug and stepped toward the front window. At first she thought she was imagining it. A low vibration hummed faintly through the glass. Not wind, not a plow, something deeper, steadier. She set the mug down and leaned closer. The sound grew louder. Not one engine. Many. Within seconds the hum became a rolling thunder that carried across the frozen fields surrounding Cedar Hollow. Curtains shifted along the street as neighbors stepped toward their windows in confusion. Maple Ridge Road, which had returned to stillness the afternoon before, now trembled beneath the approach of something unmistakable. Margaret opened her front door slowly. The air was crisp, the snowpack firm after a night of freezing temperatures. In the distance, a line of motorcycles appeared at the bend in the road, headlights reflecting in sharp bursts against the white landscape. They rode in tight formation, engines synchronized, chrome flashing in the morning light. 1 became 5. 5 became 20. The line did not end. It stretched farther than she could see from her porch. 100 motorcycles rolled into Cedar Hollow with controlled precision, slowing as they reached Maple Ridge Road. Neighbors stepped onto porches, phones raised, expressions ranging from shock to disbelief. Sheriff Harper's cruiser appeared at the far end of the street, lights off, but present. He did not intervene. He watched. The motorcycles came to a complete stop in front of Margaret Whitmore's house, lining both sides of the road in a formation that extended nearly a quarter-mile. Engines idled briefly, then one by one, they cut off. Silence followed. Heavy, respectful. Helmets were removed. Leather jackets bore the same unmistakable patch that had stood on her porch the night before. At the center of the formation, Jack Iron Callahan stepped forward, Ethan beside him, the blue scarf visible against his dark jacket. Margaret remained on her porch, one hand resting lightly against the railing. Her expression held more curiosity than fear. Jack removed his gloves and approached slowly up the clear driveway. He stopped at the bottom of her steps. "Ma'am," he said clearly enough for those nearby to hear, "yesterday you opened your door to 15 stranded men. Today, 100 have come to stand at yours." A murmur moved through the gathered riders, not loud, but unified. Ethan stepped forward slightly, voice steady. "You told us to carry it forward." "So we did." Jack continued. "There are developers who have been pressuring properties along this road. There are people who mistake kindness for weakness. We wanted it. Known that no one stands alone here." Margaret looked from Jack to the line of motorcycles stretching beyond the bend. Her eyes glistened faintly, though her posture remained upright and composed. "I did not help you for protection," she said softly. Jack nodded. "We know. That is why it means something." He gestured behind him. Without another word, several riders began unloading tools from saddlebags and trailers that had followed the formation. Lumber, roofing materials, fresh paint, snow blowers. They moved with organized efficiency, spreading out along her fence line, inspecting loose shingles, reinforcing a sagging section of porch railing she had planned to repair for years. No one shouted. No one postured. They worked. Across the street, Harold Bennett lowered his arms slowly, his earlier suspicion replaced by something closer to awe. Sheriff Harper stepped out of his cruiser but remained silent, watching as 100 bikers repaired and reinforced the smallest house on Maple Ridge Road. Margaret descended her steps carefully and stood before Jack. "You have made quite a scene," she said gently. Jack offered a faint smile. "Not a scene, ma'am. A statement." And as the winter sun rose higher above Cedar Hollow, the echo of engines was replaced by the steady rhythm of hammers, the scrape of shovels, and the quiet understanding that sometimes the loudest reputation bows respectfully to the simplest act of kindness. By late afternoon, Maple Ridge Road no longer looked like the quiet, overlooked corner of Cedar Hollow it had been just 48 hours earlier. The sagging porch railing had been replaced with solid oak beams, sanded smooth and secured tight. Loose shingles on Margaret's roof were removed and replaced. A section of fence that had leaned for years now stood straight and reinforced against future storms. Even the narrow walkway leading to her mailbox had been widened and packed down firm, so ice would not form beneath her steps. 100 bikers moved with coordination that came from discipline, not chaos. No loud music. No reckless display. Only steady work beneath a clear winter sky. Margaret stood near the porch for much of it, wrapped in her wool coat, offering coffee and sandwiches she insisted on preparing despite the protests. Ethan worked closest to the house, tightening bolts along the new railing. When he finished, he stepped back and studied the structure with quiet pride. "This will hold through any winter," he said. Margaret ran her gloved hand along the wood, feeling its strength. "I suppose it will," she replied softly. Jack approached once the final tools were packed away. The road remained lined with motorcycles, chrome glinting in the fading sunlight. Neighbors no longer whispered behind curtains. Many now stood openly on their porches, watching with expressions that had shifted from suspicion to something more thoughtful. Harold Bennett even crossed the street halfway before stopping, unsure of what to say. Sheriff Harper leaned against his cruiser, arms folded, observing a scene that required no intervention. Jack removed his gloves slowly. "Ma'am," he said, "what happened here will be remembered. Not because of us. Because of you." Margaret met his eyes steadily. "I only opened a door," she replied. Jack shook his head gently. "You opened more than that." He extended his hand, not in dominance, but in respect. Margaret took it. His grip was firm, but careful. Ethan stepped forward next, removing the blue scarf from around his neck. He held it out to her. "I believe this belongs to you." Margaret looked at the scarf, then at his face. "Keep it," she said, "as a reminder." Ethan swallowed hard and nodded once. The engines began to start one by one, the deep rumble rolling down Maple Ridge Road in a controlled wave. Helmets were secured. Riders mounted their machines. Before climbing onto his motorcycle, Jack turned once more toward Margaret. "If you ever need anything," he said simply, "you will not stand alone." Margaret gave a faint smile. "I never did," she replied. The formation pulled away slowly, not in haste, but with deliberate calm. 100 motorcycles rode out of Cedar Hollow in perfect order, their sound echoing across snow-covered fields before fading into the distance. Silence returned to Maple Ridge Road, but it felt different now. Stronger. Margaret stepped back onto her porch and looked at the reinforced railing, the cleared driveway, the straightened fence. Across the street, Harold Bennett removed his hat and gave her a small nod. Sheriff Harper tipped his head respectfully before driving off. The town would talk, as towns always do. But they would also remember. Inside her modest home, Margaret placed a fresh log into the stove and returned to her rocking chair. She looked at her son's photograph above the mantel. The house stood firmer than it had in years. Not because of fear, not because of force, but because kindness had been met with honor. And in Cedar Hollow, on Maple Ridge Road, that was more than enough.